Good evening, everybody. So this is going to be one of my HEMA related videos. And it's interesting because HEMA, which is short for Historical European Martial Arts, it is definitely, it has definitely grown a lot in the last 25 years. It kind of began in the mid 1990s, mostly in the UK, but also Australia and probably going back to the 80s to some degree with certain SCA folks, SCA being Society for Creative Anachronism. You've got people in Ren Fair who are trying to do their own version of that, but in reality, for the most part, we didn't have the fencing texts available in a big way. There's a guy named Patri Pugliese who reproduced a bunch of old HEMA texts, and he's the reason that people like the Staccato School and others, got copies of these texts. Now, other texts, came to the forefront, and then eventually stuff ended up online. Sometime in the late 90s, certain groups across the different waters became aware of each other. And so HEMA, which at the time it was WMA, for the most part, it was Western martial arts, okay, versus Eastern martial arts. If you've been around for a while, you know what Western martial arts are, and you know that it's not bang bang cowboy stuff. Well, it could include that as well. Bowie knife, tomahawk, things like that, okay? But as far as it relates to like swordsmanship, grappling arts, sword and shield, dagger, all kinds of stuff, right? Like medieval combat, which most of what we think of as medieval combat is actually like Renaissance combat. And there's a lot of texts. And oh my gosh, there's a lot. And I mean, when I got into this back in 2005, so going back like 21 years, there was a lot of text available. Like the Arma had a bunch of text, it probably still does, for free. There's more obscure texts at the time that are now available either in printed or even digital form. There's, in the last 10 plus years, there's been a lot more quality HEMA videos. You go back to the mid and late 2000s, much of what was available at the time kind of sucks by comparison. I'm not going to lie. I mean, there were some pretty bad interpretations of a lot of stuff, even by people that were well respected in the community who had been doing this stuff for 20 years at that time. Okay. I would say most of my interpretations have kind of stood the test of time since then, but even my stuff has evolved and changed because there's different texts that you have to look at, and you have to kind of separate one from the other. I mean, I remember going to Ren Fair in Muskogee Castle in Oklahoma, and the guy was basically saying how the German and Italian systems are basically the same, which I was already aware at that point that wasn't really the case. So, I mean, you compare Fiore's system to what you see in Meyer, which is basically a later version of all the Lichtenauer system, as it was becoming obsolete in combat to some degree, and it was becoming more of a sport in 1570. Okay. I mean, longswords would still kind of exist, but not much longer after that point. Like it's more in places like Scotland when you still had even antique two-handed style claymores that were still being used on occasion. But generally speaking, even then you had mostly basket-hilted broadswords. Okay, so single-handed swords, single-handed claymores. Okay, in fact, the word claymore is probably more of a reference to that blade than the two-hander. There's been a lot of debate over the last 25 years. I've been to the Scottish Games quite a bit, and I've heard a lot of different things from different people, some who even own antique blades. That doesn't mean they're experts. One of them I would put as I would say the amateur expert category, because he bought a lot of blades from, reputable antique dealers, okay? But a lot of people say a lot of things that are just proven to not be true over time. And you have people that studied the text back then that kind of stopped, and then, you know, their interpretation doesn't really line up as much. Okay. And yeah, all that being said, 5 minutes into the video, we're going to talk about what I really want to talk about. And what that is I was having a discussion with a friend of mine who runs a martial arts school. I'm not going to show the full name, but I'll show you part of the logo. And he posted something about Glima. Now, Glima is a Norse wrestling system that does go back to antiquity. To some, at least, it goes back hundreds of years in traceable history. Beyond that, you could say that, you know, maybe it got remade, it got, you know, whatever. It's hard to say, but we can go back at least a couple hundred years and say that it's been around that whole time, and probably dates back to the Viking era. But there's also, that's the one where they grip on the belt, the harness on the pants. And all of the old footage I see is that version. Now you see stuff popping up that you have people that are Viking reenactors, who are also doing this freestyle version that it's just like freestyle wrestling. You've got like a couple different versions of what they're calling Glima that I didn't see before and weren't really showing up on the internet. So when my friend posted this on his page, I was kind of skeptical, and respectfully, of course. And this isn't to crap on the combative ability of those other systems that are being demonstrated. It's about the antiquity, whether it really is a lineage-based Viking system. That's the key for me, because it's being presented as if it is. And I don't think those other two systems are, even if what they're doing was actually done back in the Viking era, which it probably was. Okay, that's the thing. I'm not questioning whether even these techniques that you see at these reenactment events were even used. They probably were used, and maybe even the same fashion and same type of setting. That doesn't mean that what these guys are doing now can trace an unbroken chain, or even has an unbroken chain, traceable or not, back to that era. That's what I'm getting at. Whereas the harness version seems to, and does go back at least a couple hundred years, okay? In Icelandic history, you got these Norwegians and Swedes that are saying, oh, what about this and that? And it's like, I think they're kind of like overusing the word Glima. That's kind of my concern. And it's kind of like there was this like fake Viking martial art called Stav. And Stav, you have these guys doing standing, using runic symbols and like all this other stuff, right? These stances, and using like a staff. Well, the Viking weapons were like axe, round shield, sword, round shield, two-handed axe, things like that. Like the staff really wasn't the main weapon at all. And of course, yeah, the sax dagger. They had bow and arrow. They had spears. All that stuff. Like the staff was not really a primary weapon in any way, shape, or form in the Viking world. Okay, it just wasn't. I mean, that's something a shepherd might be using. Is that what it is? I don't know. Then you got Sven S. Svensson III, who did Berserker Viking fighting, which people thought was hilarious. He had techniques like rape the rapist. It's like shoving a pencil in someone's pee hole, because they're a rapist and you're going to stop them. Stuff like that. None of this is necessarily Viking era stuff. And the Vikings were doing the raping, by the way. Just to be upfront. Okay, just let's be real about history. Okay, they were not the good guys. They had some pretty cool sagas. At home, they acted a certain way, but when they went a Viking, they became the bad guys. They were not the good guys. Okay, so to glorify them is, in my opinion, not justified. And Matt Easton of Skull Gladiatoria, he kind of overemphasized that too some years back in one of his videos. And I agree with him in retrospect. I mean, he wasn't wrong. Okay. There's still some pretty fascinating artwork and cultural stuff from Scandinavia. And the Icelandic sagas are really fun to read. I recommend you check them out. This also brings up another point. So Stav is a fake martial art. Berserker Viking fighting was BS. I think that two of these systems of what are now considered Glima might fall in that category, even if the techniques are actually good and legit. More combatively effective than Stav, okay? But then here's something else that comes to mind. All right, I've seen documentaries on Pankration, also known as Pankration, which is a mixed martial art created by Jim Arvanitis, who was basically early era mixed martial art. Like 1960s or 70s, he created, or recreated rather, Pankration. Okay, he was of Greek ancestry. He had some Greco-Roman wrestling in his background. He did some, kickboxing. I think he had some Muay Thai. I believe judo and jiu-jitsu were also part of his repertoire. And basically, then he studied a bunch of pottery shards from Greek artwork and essentially reconstructed other techniques that would have been used in ancient Greece. And I think that's really cool. But that means he was essentially taking stuff that had a living tradition and then studying stuff that no longer had a living tradition and reconstructing that other stuff, mixing it with the stuff that did have the lineage, and then repackaging it as Pankration. Okay? That sounds really cool. And it is an effective mixed martial art, right? You don't hear about it too often these days, but I remember about a decade or so ago, like it was pretty well known. And there have been documentaries that say, yes, Pankration, the original Greek martial art, and it survived into modern times. And it's like, no, it didn't. It didn't survive into modern times. The only relic that survived would have been Greco-Roman wrestling. And even that, here's my thought on that too, though. Just like boxing, we can trace our current boxing roots back to, let's just say, the pugilism of 1700s England, for example. Can we trace it definitively back to the ancient Greeks who were actually tying, bags to their hands to protect their hands and to also scrape across their opponent's faces and rip their faces open? I mean, I don't know if we have that lineage, okay? Just like with the Greco-Roman wrestling. Did we recreate that at some point in like the Victorian era or something? And I don't know. I mean, then you got all the stuff that Fiore de la Barry was doing, all the stuff that Ott the Jew, there's Ott Judd and Judd Liu and Ott the Jew, both of which were Jews that I think did wrestling that became amalgamated into the Lichtenauer system of fighting. Does that mean it was a Jewish system of wrestling? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. Probably not. Okay. I mean, they were living in Europe at the time. They've been living in Europe for at least hundreds of years at that point. And they were probably practicing a European style of wrestling, most likely. And it just kind of begs the point, like, where did that derive from? It probably derived from earlier Greek and Roman styles of wrestling. I wouldn't be surprised if the Italian Renaissance grappling arts and the German, Renaissance grappling arts all sprang from the same source, and that Europe in general had that kind of tradition. But then again, in the British Isles, you had grappling arts that were not derived from Greco-Roman, that did go back to antiquity. And how much of that stuff made its way into the post-Roman world? I don't know. That's the thing. And then how much of the Greco-Roman stuff derived possibly from the Egyptian wrestling techniques? I know that people in modern times have even used this Egyptian historical artwork to reconstruct other wrestling techniques to teach their wrestling students. So that's the thing. How much of this has a natural lineage? How much of it literally died out? How much of it even in ancient times got reconstructed from artwork? How much of it in modern, we're talking Victorian era, perhaps, got reconstructed from artwork? I'm curious about all of this, okay? Because we're not going to have a definitive lineage, most likely, for any of this stuff going back to antiquity. Doesn't mean it's not tracing generation by generation back to that time, but how much of what they're doing now does trace back to a common source, and how much of it has a polygenesis, if you will. Like, here's what we have now. There's some Greco-Roman, there's some Gaulish, there's some ancient Brittonic, there's some Egyptian, then you've got like this possible Jewish separate influence, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Is there a polygenesis where it just amalgamated over time? Where people just reinventing the wheel all the time, which I think happens a lot too. So I study the Angelo system of Highland Broadsword. I've done that for like 21 years now, almost. In fact, come September, it will be 21 years since I got a copy of Angelo's system and actually started using it, okay? And in doing so, we'd go back to other systems of Highland Broadsword and sort of interpret them through that lens mostly. But try to be as objective as I can while looking at all of them. Now, Thomas Page's is the most unique of all of them. His footwork is different than all the other systems of Highland Broadsword, okay? And Highland Broadsword is kind of a generic term because by the late early 1800s, you still had Highland regiments that were using the broadsword. And that system later became part of the British military for non-Highlanders, for police officers, for cutlass as opposed to broadsword, okay? Now, I practice by interpreting this chart right here, okay? I've had this chart for over 20 years, okay? Or for about, well, 19 or 20 years I've had this exact chart. You can see the dog here. You can see the lamination coming apart. This has been well loved. It's got pinholes in it because I pin it to the wall, okay? So I've had this for a while. And my buddy Brad and I reconnected in 2016 and started practicing. And we learned from each other, but we had learned separately beforehand, reconstructed separately. I became aware of a couple of additional techniques that exist on the other chart. And we started working on that stuff together. He got a little bit away from some of the other stuff he was doing, and we kind of centered more on other, the system that we pretty much have now that we haven't been able to practice together with much in the last several years, but we put together some pretty good stuff, okay? But for me to say we're doing Angelo's Highland Broadsword techniques, that we're studying his system, that we're practicing his system, that wouldn't be inaccurate. That would be probably pretty accurate because this chart was being sold. It was intended to be studied as a chart. Okay, other manuals, same thing. Now, granted, you probably should have sought out instruction and training partners at the fencing schools, notably Angelo's school, but this stuff existed and you could practice these drills at home. I mean, look at it. This is the single best text right here and is a single page, okay? You can study all the books out there with no images and not get half the information that you're going to get from this, okay? This is superior to anything else you're going to study on Highland Broadsword. And it's so much easier to get the complete system of at least the cut and thrust, well, not the thrust, sorry, the cuts and the guards, the advancing and retreating footwork. Not the traverse, not the thrusts, but, the other aforementioned items, okay? And get most of the system that he was teaching, okay? Like, you couldn't, within months, you can master this stuff pretty well. At least those movements. Now, how you apply that in sparring, that's different, okay? And it's good to have a variety of partners and people with different heights, different, body types, different levels of strength as well, different levels of skill. You can learn by training with people that are inferior to you in fighting ability. It teaches you something about your own skills, and it shows you what they're lacking, and even kind of helps you check yourself on mistakes you could be making. So that's why it's good to train with a lot of people. Okay. And I've taught a lot of kids too. So, I mean, there's a lot of things I learned from teaching kids how to do this system specifically. Now, and I have some good memories of doing that. It was a lot of fun. Those kids are great. But for me to say that I'm training in Angelo's system, that I practice and teach his system, would be an accurate statement. To say though that that I'm practicing that I belong to the Angelo school, that would be incorrect. I do not belong to the Angelo school. There is no Angelo school. In fact, is there even a living lineage? I don't know. There's Maestro Paul MacDonald of Scotland, Guy Windsor, who now of Finland, but from England originally, and all these people from the early Don Duelist school that learned from, I can't remember the guy's name, but he had a lineage of single stick. And so he was teaching that. And it's, it's the only surviving single stick lineage system, but I don't know how far back it goes. I think it goes back to the 1800s, but how far into the 1800s, I don't know. Because Angelo's system as a lineage survived definitively back into the 1860s. The Confederate Army was using his system to train Confederate troops. Okay, let's just put it that way. There's a manual that studies his system that mentions Angelo, as I recall. And so, just saying, all right. It outlived Henry Sr. by some time, but eventually it became less used in an official capacity. So it went on the decline. I do not belong to the Angelo school. I train and study the Angelo school's system, though. I cannot claim that I have a lineage back to Angelo in my training, so therefore I cannot say that I am practicing, that whatever survives me when it comes to teaching this stuff and whatever I have learned and teach my students, that's not going to be the same as me saying, oh, well, you all belong to the Angelo school and our lineage traces back to that. You guys see my point? This is the whole conundrum of HEMA altogether, is that we're reconstructing systems that have been dead for centuries. Okay? For the most part, centuries. These systems have been dead. They survive through texts. There are some systems that exist that might be derivative, maybe, from some of our favorite manuals. But we don't know for sure, and that's the problem. So these are reconstructed arts, and these are good arts. You can, I don't care what some people say, you can reconstruct a dead martial art, but you got to be intellectually honest about how you do it. You got to look in the mirror. You got to look at the images. You got to read the text. You have to really work hard at doing it. And then you got to train and fight people with it. Okay? Like, you got to have sparring matches. And that's going to teach you how effective is your stuff. How well do you know this stuff? But even then, you can reconstruct techniques that where you're interpreting it incorrectly, but still come up with a good technique. But then later realize, oh yeah, that's actually not the technique that's in the book. Now that I've studied it harder, I realize that's not actually the real technique out of Fiore. But it's still kind of cool and it still kind of works, right? That new technique is part of your system. It's not part of Fiore's system. You guys catch my drift? There's things that I've added to my personal system that don't exist in that exact fashion within any of the Highland Broadsword texts, but it's still part of my Highland Broadsword system. So that'll be a part of my lineage going forward, mine and Brad's, because we've trained together and we've both been using this stuff. Okay. And whenever I teach people, whenever I get far enough in the training process with new students at the Highland Games and things like that, this stuff eventually gets to them, hopefully, but it doesn't always get to that point. So I'm not training regularly every week or even every month with anybody. I got to go see my friend more and do stuff at his school, but he's got a lot of other stuff to teach that I want to practice. And I'm more than happy to teach my stuff to some of his other students. So it's, but yeah, I mean, I can't say that any of my preferred martial arts have a very solid lineage. Now, I mean, I've done some boxing, kickboxing. I've done Wing Chun. I have a lineage for that. That's definitively traces back to Itman. Okay, but as far as, I mean, I'm not a Sifu, right? I'm still, you know, I'm a lower level student because my training was never complete. Okay, but I got pretty good with what I knew. But still, there's, well, at least I, you know, seemed to be the case. But there's more, and you got to keep practicing an art like that. But yeah, I mean, boxing, kickboxing, I'm pretty good with my kicks against the bag. Okay. But yeah, I mean, I would like to practice more Mendoza pugilism. Brad and I were doing that for a minute, and then we kind of, you know, fell off course. But, you know, he was teaching me some backhold wrestling. You can see some old videos of that on my channel. I was definitely overweight, and I definitely need more training. I wouldn't consider myself someone that's qualified even remotely to teach any of that stuff. So, but then again, if I watched enough videos and trained with enough people that were interested, we could figure some of it out. You can figure the techniques out without having a lineage instructor, but it's good to have someone who has the right knowledge. It's like I practice some Doyle Irish stick on my own, but I've never trained with anybody who has a lineage. So there's going to be certain things that you teach yourself incorrectly that they comment on in the groups and in their videos that show that, you know, you gotta train with somebody. You gotta train with one of their official instructors to really get certain things down correctly. Okay. So I'm certain it'd be the same thing with Angelo. If I were to go back in time a couple hundred years and go to, you know, Maestro Angelo's school, I'm sure there's a lot of other stuff related to Highland Broadsword that he would be able to teach me that I did not learn in the manuals. Doesn't mean I couldn't whoop him with a Highland Broadsword. I might still be able to whoop him. I don't know. You know, that's the whole thing. It's hard to say. But is there more stuff that you can learn? Even after studying all the published literature from these individuals on the subject? Yeah, I'm sure there's more. So, I mean, there's a lot of things you can do with the Highland Broadsword that you can take out of the Messer texts and even do some half sorting that doesn't show up anywhere in these broadsword texts, but could still be used. Okay, but in any case, to claim that this is an unbroken line would be falsehood. I have to openly admit that there's no living lineage that I've studied that goes back to this stuff. Yet I've become pretty good at the system. Or rather, you might say that I've developed a system, and that Brad and I developed a system together. We refined each other's personal systems through much practice, much studying, much diligent research on this. And that's the best we can do. I'm not going to go fight anyone for real with a broadsword, although I would be confident that I can fight with a machete in South America. I don't have any doubt that I can fight someone with a machete and win against someone who's trained their whole lives in machete. I'm pretty confident. I'm just saying, okay? Like I said, 21 years almost of Highland Broadsword. You just got to get used to the spatial difference because of the different lengths of the weapon. But a lot of the same movements would apply. They're both single-handed swords. Okay. Anyhow, those are my thoughts for now. I'm just let me know your thoughts on HEMA in general, what you think of the lineage stuff. You know, if you know any living lineages, if you have interest in weapons that are no longer lineage based, if you need some direction where to find good information, I'll be happy to help. Thanks for watching.